Welcome back to Media 7. We're discussing the demise of one of New Zealand's feistiest dailies, the Daily Chronicle, with our panel. Former Fairfax Editor-in-Chief and one-time Managing Editor of NZPA, Peter O'Hara, listener staff writer and newspaper veteran Joanne Black, and investigative journalist John Stevenson. Peter, if we could start with you, this seems to be a paper that's done everything right. It's increased its circulation, it's made money, it's done what everyone worldwide is doing, gone down to tabloid size, and it's had strong local reporting. And it didn't work. Is there some sense in which the die was cast a long time ago for this paper?
Yeah, well, firstly, I would say that I think that the issue of the council is a red herring. The die was cast a long time ago. In fact, I think for 2 or 3 years it's looked probable that the Levin Chronicle would have to change format, change publication dates or do something radical, because it was simply the economy of scale was against it as a paid daily newspaper.
You had a chance to buy the Chronicle when you were at Fairfax, didn't you?
Yes, indeed. It was certainly a possibility at one stage, and I think at that time the APN stable viewed it very much as a dog and one that should be moved on. And that was some time ago.
Yeah. Do you think in a bygone era a big publisher might have stood by a regional paper like this on principle?
Well, I think times are very different right now. In the first 5 years of this decade, the New Zealand economy was in fantastic mode for newspaper publishers, double-digit growth every year. But in this last 3 years, times have become tough, and this year in particular, I think things are really stretching newspaper publishers. So in that sort of climate, you're going to find that there will be increasingly tough decisions have to be made.
And yet there's some sense, and certainly that's the sense that Simon got down there, is that if this had been an independent publication, it may well have had a better chance of surviving. Well,
I think it is true that in some cases you could be more fleet of foot, and you may have some different overhead structures which would enable you to publish differently. I think I would like to say firstly that I think it's got a good future anyway as a bi-weekly. Increasingly worldwide there is a focus on hyper-local journalism, and I would say that if the Levin Chronicle now does things very well locally as a twice-a-week publication, it could still have a very, very good strong future and be that advocate for its community.
Joanne, as a journalist, are you sad to see a paper go this way?
Well, I'm always sad when newspapers or dogs die, actually. And yeah, I mean, it's the loss of another voice, and that's regret for the community. But I think there are some things that we have to bear in mind about Levin, which are not unique to Levin, but are worth noting, which is that it's only, just over an hour's drive from Wellington, so there's probably quite a few people there who identify with the city community. It's also quite well served. It's in the circulation area of the Dominion Post, so it's got a strong...
And the Manawatu Evening Standard.
And the Manawatu Evening Standard. And there's also a local weekly, I think the Horowhenua Mail. So there's quite a lot of competition there. It's not like it's left with no voice at all. If you add to that, I think it was evident from that video we saw... the delivery man was talking about job losses, and it's not a particularly wealthy area. And if it's already marginal with such a small circulation, then it may well take just the loss of one more employer for the owners to say, it's heading in a certain direction, and we either move now or...
Do you think it's also a little bit like what we've seen happen to evening papers? Because certainly the paper I started on, the Christchurch Star, I arrived there as a cadet, and it was a newspaper with a national profile. It campaigned. I got to sit next to Bruce Ansley as he was grinding out his columns. And now the same thing. It's a twice-weekly free sheet.
Yes, it's hard to say. Is it a reflection on the newspaper that it wasn't serving its community well enough if it goes? Did it not... You have to at some stage say, well, the newspaper wasn't doing what the community wanted if it was unable to survive. I mean, it's a pretty harsh media market out there. It is for all newspapers. And I mean, when I was at the Evening Post during the merger with the Dominion, and I remember then there was this big outcry from the community, and people said, well, why didn't you tell us it was in danger, because we would have tried to save it. And actually the message, I think, is that we've got that chance all the time. We need to support media or we lose it.
John, Peter's poo-pooed the idea that the council solved its problem with this paper by pulling its advertising, but certainly Councillor Anne Hunt implied that that's what had happened.
Well, I must say, Russell, I didn't poo-poo that particular idea. What I said was I don't think that was the cause of the demise of the Levin Chronicle as a daily.
Right, fair enough. If that is what happened, then you have to wonder where APN's chest beating about free speech is now, because it's made a lot of noise about these issues.
Yes, it's a good point, and it's a pity someone from APN hasn't been prepared to front the media and explain the whys and wherefores.
They did send us their press release.
Yes, which was about as clear as mud, I have to say. But yes, if that is the case, it would be very disturbing, because at the end of the day, the Daily Chronicle has been doing, by all accounts, a very good job in holding the centres of power down in that region to account, the local council, the regional council, businesses, etc. And that's the core function of journalism. And if it's been punished by the council through the withholding of advertising, ratepayers' money, by the way, because
we're
it's
saying
doing, if it's been punished for that, it's basically been punished by the council for doing its job, for holding the powers to account, and that would be very disturbing.
Do you think this is happening elsewhere?
Well, it happens all the time. I mean, when I worked at the Independent, Warren Berryman was constantly getting pressured by advertisers because of stories he ran, and he had a very hardline approach. He used to say, the only person who decides what goes in this paper is me, and frankly, he suffered for it.
I think APN's got a lot of capacity to withstand pressure, and I think it's done that on a lot of occasions in a lot of its mastheads. I'm sure if this paper was profitable, it wouldn't be closing.
But it was profitable.
Well, but it must have been trending and heading a certain way, because the Evening Post was also profitable when it closed, but they could see the writing on the wall, and in order to save the masthead at all, it's better to do something than let it just die.
I think the point is that either way there's a problem. Either it's folded to pressure when it should have stood up to pressure, or it's a symptom of a wider trend in New Zealand media, and that is the focus on the focus of the abdication really of a lot of our fourth estate responsibilities and obligations on the altar of cost cutting.
Well, and I wonder if all of you think we're seeing what's happened with commercial radio, which is absolutely a duopoly. Every now and then, one of the last handful of local radio stations gets bought up and turned into more FM.
Well, I think in reality the New Zealand newspaper industry is a duopoly as well, in reality. I'd like to take up the point, though, that John has made. And in my experience as a senior manager in the newspaper industry, I'd have to say that New Zealand's got a very, very strong record of defending its editors and defending its editorial people. And I've experienced many instances where advertisers have brought pressure to bear or whatever, and editors, in my experience, get totally supported by their management. I'd also reiterate what Joanne is saying. I think there's a large responsibility on the newspaper itself to connect with its community and to actually be seen by its community as it owning the newspaper. And I think when you get that situation, when you strongly hold your territory, no matter what your size is and your frequency of delivery or whatever, you're in a very strong position.
And yet Fairfax, just like APN, is beginning to centralise sub-editing resources, so you're taking institutional knowledge out of these local papers. Yeah, that's not going to end in a good way, is it?
I'm not in Fairfax now, but what I would say about that is that's a product of technology, really. And the technology that's been introduced in the last couple of years has enabled sub-editing to be centralised to some extent. I would also say that there's a real shortage of sub-editing expertise in some of the smaller centres, and this may well assist them.
John, you worked for what was effectively a family publisher. It was a family proprietor, and it was a small paper. Do you think you get something out of that as a journalist learning the ropes that you don't get from a bigger paper?
Well, I think you get something out of working in any publication where the editor and the staff are good and passionate and motivate you, but particularly for young journalists, and this is a big problem in New Zealand, there are a lot of journalists coming out of the media training organisations, and they're going out looking for jobs. So you've got a twofold problem. The people who are going out to have work experience have lost another paper, another training opportunity, but also the graduates that are coming out have lost another paper where they can start off. And of course a lot of good papers, as you've pointed out, start out those provincial papers and work their way up.
You also learn how to economise, because some of them are incredibly mean. The first daily newspaper I worked on, which was privately owned, they made our shorthand pads out of newsprint, and they had no back on them, and you tried to take notes and the thing folded up. I mean, they are incredibly tight. And
we had paper bags.
I can beat you. We had spaghetti sandwiches at the Christmas party.
But look, I think to some extent, without sort of sounding petty, we're missing the point. I think, as I said, this is a symptom of a bigger problem. I mean, Al Pacino says in the movie The Inside, what are we? Are we newsmen or are we businessmen? And I think the reality today is that the fourth estate is seen, or journalism is seen, not so much as focusing on public duty, and there are journalists that do, but it's also about making money. The emphasis has shifted. There's a lot of emphasis on making money. And the bottom line for many media organisations, in my experience and the experience of a lot of journalists I speak to, is in fact the bottom line.
But what's paying our wages?
Well, there's no one saying, as Edward R. Murray said, there's no law that says dollars have to be defeated by duty. But at the end of the day, why are we in the job? What's the purpose of journalism? I mean, if you agree with people like the Israeli journalist Amira Haas, our job is essentially, before anything else, to monitor the the centres of power. Now, taking out the Daily Chronicle means that, sure, they'll be served by Dom Post and the Star Times and TVNZ and TV3, but they don't have offices in Levin. They don't know the community. They don't know the issues. They don't know the events. And it is taking out, just as you take out a GP, sure, you might have a great hospital in Wellington or Auckland, but it's taking out an important player in that's what should be a seamless web of holding organisations to account.
Without a doubt, newspapers are commercial organisations and there is a profit imperative. But equally, they only exist because of the strength of their editorial product. And newspaper managers everywhere are only too well aware of the importance of that editorial product and the need to have strong content to connect with your readership. Now, if you lose track of that, you are in danger. But
that's why a lot of organisations are in danger, because they're running rubbish and a lot of the public are voting with their feet.
Just before we go to break,
that's a fair point. And I think that newspapers everywhere have to be absolutely insistent on meeting what their readers need and be constantly aware of what their readers are looking for. And there are choices now.
Yes, but I think, look, we've just got to be frank as practising journalists. You know, the media in New Zealand, and this is no secret, is in something of a crisis. I mean, Peter Griffin, a friend of mine, is an ex-journalist, said the other day, every second journalist is looking to get out of the profession. I mean, if you want to see where all the good journalists are, well, a lot of them, go down to the press secretary office in Wellington. Most of them are working for Labour. It's really disturbing. And the bottom line is, we're in this job not to maximise returns for the shareholders. Yes, we've got to run viable businesses, but the focus has shifted so much. It's so extreme now that I really worry about.
I disagree with that, and from the position that I was in, and I know that editors and editorial people have a responsibility in this too, to ensure that they advocate at all times for what they need, and proprietors will listen because they know that without that editorial product, they're in trouble.
Yes, well, the bottom line is proprietors don't call the shots.